Okay, yeah, the other video was going longer. I get more long-winded when I redo stuff. We've got a little bit more to add to chapter 12, and that is on movement. Movement in animals is based on what are called contractile proteins. Proteins that interact with a way to make things shorter. Whether that is contracting the surface of a cell or contracting an entire muscle cell. Cellular movement we've talked about before when we talked about protozoans. There's what's called amoeboid movement with pseudopods, where actin filaments embedded underneath the membrane pull and they squeeze the membrane, and it's a hydrostatic skeleton reaction basically, although it's a single cell, so it's not called a skeleton. But it's the same sort of idea. Squeeze it and it extends out. And actually what you wind up with there is, because amoebas, in order to be active, have to have water around them, which makes them somewhat buoyant, and they have very little weight anyway, that they can't, now when I step and pull, the friction of the force of gravity between my foot and the floor generates enough pull that I can pull against that and move myself forward. Amoebas can't do that, is that they actually need to glue themselves down. If they put a pseudopod out and want to follow in that direction, they need to actually stick the pseudopod down. You can actually take amoebas and put them on a friction-free coating like you'd have in a pan. And what you'll see them do, and this is kind of interesting, is that they'll stick a pseudopod out, and when they go to flow into it, because they can't stick it down, it just comes back. And what if you watch them, what'll happen is they'll stick a pseudopod out, and then it comes back. Stick a pseudopod out, and it comes back. Stick a pseudopod out, and it comes back. It's weird. It looks like they get frustrated. They put more and more and more out simultaneously until they look like little stars, and they all just keep coming back to a point where it just kind of goes, no, screw this, and it just sits there. They use those kind of plates when you want to put cells down and not lose track of them. You can put them on a grid, and okay, the amoebas in grid, A23 is that, and then we're going to treat them with stuff, and then see how it affects their movement, or see whatever you're checking. But at least they're not wandering all over the place and you lose track of what's what. The amoeba in K12 just gave us the pseudopod equivalent of the finger. And then of course you have ciliary movement and flagellar movement. Ciliary movement, lots and lots and lots of little moving fingers. Not a terribly effective movement for large animals, although snails and slugs use it fairly well. Flagellar movement, great if you're a filter feeder, if you're moving waste materials, if you're moving sperm, it's the go-to movement, although some sperm are amoeboid movement. I don't know of any ciliated sperm. I'm sure they exist, but I've never heard of them. We've talked about muscle, right? We've got the 4 types. 3 of the types are striated, where muscle proteins overlap one another and then they kind of ratchet past one another in order to pull the anchor points in. You've got these floating, they call them fiber proteins. I've got actin and myosin, is that my elbow would be at an anchor point. This would be just floating. There'd be another one over here with an anchor point. Anchor point. Anchor point. And there'd be millions and millions and millions of these. So many of them that when you look at it under a microscope, even our light microscopes, you can see the fine lines of the anchors. You see a light zone, you see a dark zone where these overlap, you see another light zone, you see a dark zone, you see a light zone, you see the anchor points. And when they contract, this gets closer to these ends, and the white gaps disappear because it's all overlap at that point. There actually are, I forget what animals actually can overcontract And these will actually get to the anchor point and curl up and produce a new dark layer line at the anchor points. Neat trick. This is actin and myosin. Myosin, myo meaning muscle. Actin is what the pseudopods use also. It is a very universal contractile protein, and one of those molecules that doesn't abide much messing with is that the homology, the amino acid sequence of actin is remarkably similar across not just animals, but animals and funguses and all sorts of things that use amoeboid movement. Is that evolution, anytime evolution has tried to tinker with the sequence of actin, it's apparently very easy to screw up, and of course, you're not going to survive with screwed up contractile proteins, and pretty much impossible to improve upon, because with billions of years of separation evolutionarily, they're still really similar across a wide swath of living things. When you run, as your foot comes down, it stretches. Now, tendons don't stretch much, but they do stretch a little bit. It stretches the tendons as you come down, and as you release, the tendons release also. And so you can store energy in some of your connections. I said tendons, I meant ligaments. Tendons do store a little bit of energy. Their tendons and ligaments do different things, but they're essentially the same sort of tissue. And there are muscular structures that will store energy. You bend it and kind of set it in place and kind of release it. Is that there's one of the more primitive insects in the world, collembolans, have this little thing they call a furcula. It's underneath them, and they click it up into place, and it's got these elastic fibers attached to it. And if you bug them, it releases and goes doink, and they just disappear. Similar to what happens in flea legs, but flea legs store the energy in a different way. Is that it's not just like one little clicking rod. Some people think collembolans cause weird diseases. If you run into that, they don't. Of course, energy in living things, you need ATP. And in skeletal muscles, you can have something called oxygen debt. You need your muscles to work. You try to get as much oxygen to them as you can. You're running from a predator, And at some point, your oxygen supply can't keep up with what your muscles are asking from, or what you're asking from your muscles. Now, other cells in your body, if you drop their oxygen supply, they do very, very poorly. They will die. But your muscles can actually keep doing. Your aerobic respiration has an anaerobic stage, not terribly efficient, and then an aerobic stage that breaks the sugar down completely, gets lots of ATPs for energy. But your other cells, if you cut the oxygen off, the whole thing shuts down. In skeletal muscles, they will keep doing the first anaerobic stage and be getting some ATP to help keep them going. But you build up lactic acid. In the normal situation, a molecule like lactic acid would go right into the aerobic stage and be broken down into carbon dioxide. Here, it can build up. So you manage to get away from the predator. You get into the car and slam the door, the bear's on the outside, whatever. You've built up an oxygen debt. You have to take that buildup of lactic acid and put it through the aerobic stage, the oxygen using stage, in order to completely break it down. You're paying off your oxygen debt. That should be the only cells in your body that do that. If you're in, unfortunately, it is a system that can be turned on by tumor cells. As a tumor builds up, its oxygen supply is blood vessels around the outside and the cells farther in. Remember flatworms? The cells on the inside are a very long way from their oxygen supply. It can oxygen deprive them and kill them. Well, cancer tumors, because they're randomly activating abilities, some of them will activate a releaser that will basically say to the surrounding blood vessels, okay, bring blood vessels in here, and your blood vessels will grow into the tumor and keep those cells alive. There's actually chemotherapy that counteracts that. It's good chemotherapy because you can give it to adults. Adults are not building new blood vessels. You always want to try to poison, right? You poison the pathogen with a chemical that it uses, but we don't. With cancer, that's trickier because these are our cells. And so they're doing most of the stuff that our cells do. Here's something where you don't give it to kids, but you give it to adults. Some tumor cells, though, just go into oxygen debt. They activate the oxygen debt pathway, and they're not high energy cells anyway, so they can get by running oxygen debt, and it can keep the tumor cells alive. And you don't really want that. There really isn't any way to counteract it that I've seen anybody even try. So it's not a good potential cancer treatment, but skeletal cells, cancer cells. Okay, that's chapter 12. Hopefully the sound is all working. Here we go.